There's a lot of like stories about specific contamination events and specific, bad things that have happened in the past. But recognizing that the PFAS crisis is not a past thing. The PFAS crisis is something that our generation is currently enacting on future generations by continuing to make and use PFAS, trying to figure out how we manage the uses and the emissions of PFAS.
Frankly, if you didn't have PFAS and there are no viable substitutes, you certainly would grind the global economy to a halt.
Restrict them as much as we can, and that's gonna be the action that's gonna protect the health of current and future people.
Hey everyone, it's Arick Wierson. Welcome to another episode of Leverage Storytelling, brought to you by Tunheim. Today I have the venerable Ali Ling from St. Thomas University. Thank you for bringing the swag, by the way, and showing off your credentials there. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, happy to be here, Arick. Thanks for having me.
So Ali, today I want to talk about PFAS.
Yes.
And, I think just for sort of level set people, I guess, let me see if I get it right. Okay, PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Is that right? I got
That's
it.
Correct.
Boom. All right, bonus for me. But basically, tell people what they are, just very briefly, just a level set, and then we'll get into why we're talking about them.
Yeah, so I mean, we can go back to what that is so per and poly fluoro means that it's a compound that has fluorine stuck onto it, and so it's some combination of fluorine and carbon atoms. If you remember, like on the periodic table, those are both pretty high up. But what happens is when you stick fluorine atoms onto carbon atoms is that the fluorine atoms are like really big and bulky, and then it kind of protects the whole backbone of the carbon atoms from degrading. And those compounds end up being really useful in a lot of products that we use on a day-to-day basis. So a lot of people have probably heard about PFAS in nonstick pans or in Scotchgard and durable water repellent on outdoor clothing. But PFAS are used in a huge amount of things. So Teflon, I'm in the water wastewater industry, and so Teflon tape and using Teflon as a sealant is a really big thing. In terms of things that are either water or grease repellent, you've got food packaging, you've got textiles and clothing and shoes, you've got a wide variety of other compounds. You've got firefighting foams is kind of a big source in the environment of where these PFAS come from. The other thing about PFAS, it's per and polyfluoroalkyl, and then substances. And I think that, that word substances, it kind of captures the issue that there's a lot of them.
15,000, right?
Yes. It's
Theoretically.
Theoretically. I think the number...
But there's 600 or 700 that are basically in use, right?
Right, yeah. My understanding of the number in use is somewhere between 300 and 500.
Okay. So
it's not infinite, but it's a number that makes it challenging to wrap our heads around. How do we measure and report on these? How do we regulate them? And how do we understand how they all affect
Now, Ali, you were giving us some examples of where it's used, like nonstick pans and Scotchgard and things like that.
Yeah.
But I think that the reason that it's such a tricky, unlike, say, asbestos or nicotine, where it's just like, stop smoking or stop putting asbestos in your buildings, the truth of the matter is that, I've heard different statistics, but something like 70% or so of all the applications of PFAS are sort of deemed, depending on who you talk to, as essential uses. We're talking about things like, cutting, the wafers in semiconductors. We're talking about, critical applications in aerospace. We're talking about critical applications in med tech, heart stents, things like that, where, frankly, if you didn't have PFAS and there are no viable substitutes, you certainly would grind the global economy to a halt, And that's why it's so tricky, because on one hand, there's concerns about, the potential environmental, impacts of these PFAS, but at the same token, modern society absolutely needs them.
Right, agreed. And I think that that's one of the challenges with a lot of the legislation going on that's trying to restrict the PFAS is how do you try to establish which uses are essential and which are not? And I actually prefer the term currently unavoidable use, which is what the state of Minnesota is using in their legislation. But that, aside from essential use,
that's aspirational, I guess.
Yes. So essential use is like this is something we need. That's the end. Whereas currently unavoidable use more is about how right now we need to use it, but with advancements in R&D, we can if we're developing other things, maybe in the future we don't need to use it. And so that's kind of how I think we need to be thinking about this essential use issue, is that it's not just necessarily the snapshot for today. There's been a lot of great chemical R&D, including chemical R&D that led to PFAS and their uses, but ongoing chemical R&D can also help develop some alternatives for those uses.
As you started to look into this issue and look at specifically the economics around PFAS cleanup, PFAS contamination, ongoing costs of PFAS, what surprised you the most?
This is a really good question that I appreciate. It really just the cost of the remediation and how much that means that we can't rely on remediation alone to manage PFAS. So I guess the story behind this is, in my past life as an environmental consultant, I was working with a team that was helping the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency try to estimate the costs of removing PFAS from wastewater in Minnesota. And we did that, and the costs were...
Are you talking about industrial wastewater or
municipal
wastewater?
This is municipal wastewater.
Okay.
So we completed that study, and the estimates for the state of Minnesota was, around $15 billion over 20 years if we wanted to remove PFAS from all the wastewater in Minnesota. $15 billion for just removing PFAS from wastewater, which is a lot. To me, the question is not so much how much it costs, but it's a question of how much do you get from that money that you're investing. So if we're going to spend that much on wastewater, what's the payback? And so I came up with this metric of cost per mass of PFAS removed and destroyed from the environment. So if we're thinking about trying to limit how much PFAS gets into the environment, that metric of cost per mass destroyed is going to be really important to help us prioritize where and what technologies are going to give us the most bang for our buck. So when I did that metric and I ran that on some of the calculations we already had, I was very surprised to learn that the cost for most remediation and treatment technologies is millions of dollars per pound of PFAS removed and destroyed from soils, from water, from drinking water, from a lot of different media, but it's millions of dollars per pound. And that's compared to if you go to Home Depot and buy some product with PFAS in it. You can buy PFAS on the market for hundreds to thousands of dollars per pound, which is just the difference between those costs and that very high cost of remediation was really surprising to me.
Now, when you talk about costs, that's why we have all this litigation and all these lawsuits, because no one wants to foot the bill, right? And it's always kind of a little bit of a hot potato,
Yeah.
But the fact that we have so much litigation around the PFAS issue, isn't that symptomatic of sort of a failed infrastructure, a failed regulatory environment that is not adequately addressing this issue?
100%. And I think, one of my main talking points about PFAS is that it's not just about PFAS. I think PFAS are an example of a class of chemicals that show us that we need to rethink how we manage chemicals and how we think about chemical risks. So they're very persistent and mobile, and how do we manage those compounds with thinking about risk for the future? There's a ton of them. How do we figure out how we regulate those chemicals in products in the environment when there are so many of them? They're challenging to measure, they're challenging to regulate. So I think PFAS really kind of stretches the boundaries of how we manage chemicals. And I think we need to address PFAS as far upstream as we can, generally. But I think that we also need to learn from that and turn that around and adjust how we manage chemicals so that we're doing better in the future.
Ali, we got into the science here a little bit, and as you can see by the name of the show, this is about storytelling.
Oh, right, yeah.
So let's zoom out, way out for a little bit, and let's just talk about the narrative around PFAS. Right now, who do you think controls the narrative around PFAS?
That's a really good question. When I look at news and posts about PFAS, I do feel like it is increasing exponentially recently. So there's been more and more books about PFAS. There's been more and more articles about PFAS. And I think a lot of that good storytelling is coming out of Europe. I think they think about chemicals in a slightly different way, more focused on the prevention side.
What do you attribute that to?
I think there's a little bit more long-term thinking in Europe. I think they've been on the current residents of Europe, the societies that are running in Europe have been on their land for longer, whereas in America we're more of a colonialist society where we've arrived here and we're looking for more land to take care of, and so we don't necessarily have that long-term view where it's like, okay, we're here long-term, we need to come up with a way that we're going to live in this land where people 100 years from now can live on the land in the same way. And I think Europe is better at that, partly just because they've been in place for a longer time.
One of the things I notice when I'm in Europe is the average person, and I don't walk around talking about PFAS, but on the occasion that the issue has come up, people from all different walks of life, they seem to be very well informed about PFAS are,
Mm-hmm.
or forever chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's true here in the U.S. I mean, I'm sure some people have heard about it. There's been a couple, there's Dark Waters, which is a big
Mm-hmm.
Mark Ruffalo movie that shined a light on the issue. Apparently, Erin Brockovich's new cause celeb is PFAS. I don't know if you knew that.
I did not know that.
Yeah, she's embraced that issue. I know that there's been a number of sort of high-profile documentaries. Frontline recently did something, but it's still not the sort of top of mind issue, I think, for most Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, what do you think it's going to take? And and a lot of the headlines that are being driven are these like sort of massive, sometimes billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar lawsuits and
Mm-hmm.
settlements.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think it's going to take to get the average American sort of more attuned to this issue? Because it really is, I think, potentially one of the sort of the biggest sort of environmental stories of our time.
As with most storytelling, I think you need to understand why people might care about it and really speak to that. I'm not super jazzed about getting people really jazzed up and worried about PFAS specifically, because I think PFAS is part of a much bigger problem of how do we handle chemicals as a society. I think the drinking water narrative has got a lot of legs at least in the United States, in terms of people being really worried about PFAS in their drinking water and what can I do about it. But frankly, PFAS in drinking water is not a big source of PFAS to people's bodies. It's people get more PFAS in the food that they eat, in breathing the dust that's in their house. So I think the drinking water narrative has gotten a lot of legs just because people care about it and everyone wants clean drinking water. But I don't know how to tell the story to help people think more big picture about PFAS exposure, about other chemicals, and about kind of what can we actually do that matters.
And finally, before we conclude, Ali, I just want to ask you, what do you think is missing from the PFAS conversation? What do you wish more people were talking about, both either on the academic level, the corporate industrial level, or on the consumer side?
I think really looking at the big picture. Again, we've talked about how there's a lot of like stories about specific contamination events and specific, bad things that have happened in the past, but recognizing that the PFAS crisis is not a past thing. The PFAS crisis is something that our generation is currently enacting on future generations by continuing to make and use PFAS. And I think trying to figure out how we manage the uses and the emissions of PFAS to restrict them as much as we can without, collapsing the entire economy, restrict them as much as we can. And that's gonna be the action that's gonna protect the health of current and future people. It's not gonna be, treating all of the wastewater, treating all the drinking water, trying to clean it all up once it's already out there in the environment. It's going to be trying to go upstream and make a difference with what we're doing in making and using less PFAS.
Do you have a prediction of at what point society will have found alternatives for all PFAS?
There's probably not alternatives for all PFAS, for all of the things. And
Never.
Well, it depends on how you define alternatives, right? There's a certain function. I have a raincoat at my house, and does my raincoat need to be so waterproof that I can, hike somewhere and not get wet for like 7 hours? Probably not. I'm not going to go, it depends on how you're defining the function. I think if you define the needed use as it needs to be as good as PFAS, I don't think we're necessarily going to find things that are going to work as good as PFAS in all of the things that we're using. But I think understanding how well does something need to work, how durable it does it need to be, how grease resistant, how water repellent, how electrically inert does it need to be. If we understand like what it needs to do and figure out I think there's a lot of places where we will find alternatives that do what the products need to do, even if they don't do what PFAS are already doing.
But you think in some cases, like when it comes to, say, maybe semiconductor production or other things like that, it could be just a matter of the fact that there is no substitute.
It's possible. I think, but I wouldn't rule it out anywhere. I think we've done really amazing things with chemistry in the past couple hundred years, and I think the future of chemistry is bright.
Good. Ali, thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. For Leverage Storytelling, I'm Arick Wierson. See you next time.